Well, welcome back, everybody. Hope you've got your coffee and had a good brief break. We're going to kick off now with a talk from Andrew Byrne, who is a professor at the University College London Institute of Education. Um, and I've had the pleasure of working with Andrew for over 25 years. We were just discussing that. He was my first mentor when I did my PGCE many, many years ago. And I'm very fortunate to have kept contact with him. Andrew is, an authority on the subject of English and English education. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what he has to say on the idea of ludic literature, and so that whole idea of literature and play, which is one that kind of resonates with what Roger was talking about, and seems to me to be at the heart of perhaps what the problems are that Bob was identifying with Hirsch and his views of knowledge and curriculum in English, the absence of the idea of play and the freedom of play. So we'll very much look forward to hearing what you have to say, Andrew. So thank you. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Thanks for having me, and hello, everybody, in these strange circumstances, which we're still getting used to. So I'm going to talk about a project that I've been running over the past year or so, although it's got a longer backstory, well over 10 years, of work with students in schools designing their own 3D adventure games. Initially, we did this for the purposes of media education in schools. But more recently, I've been looking at what it might mean to use video game design as a way of interrogating literature in the classroom. So this will describe, and it will be fairly descriptive actually, though I'll try to kind of present a few guiding principles. It'll describe the work of 2 Year 10 classes, one in Yorkshire and one in London, as they design their own games based on Shakespeare's Macbeth. So it's using a software which I'll say a little bit more about as we go on, and which I'll give you a link to at the end in case anybody wants to try using it, which is called Mission Maker, which has recently been redesigned in Unity by a team at UCL, particularly Bruno de Paula and Abel Drew, who I'd like to pay tribute to for designing this. And the project has involved a design of this software, particularly for Macbeth, with particular kind of assets, including all the ingredients of the witches' cauldrons, which we've done with the British Library, and particularly Stellar Wisdom from the Digital Curator team. And also I should pay tribute to my colleagues at UCL, Theo Breyer and Jane Coles from the English team there, and their students who we've been working with. So I want to make a few general points about the use of games in relation to the English media and drama curriculum cluster. Firstly, to say, which may or may not be obvious, that games as a storytelling medium are a cognate cultural form with literature and film in many ways, though there are particular distinctive things about them. So what might the distinctive things be that would allow them to help us understand literature in new ways? I think this possibly productively unsettles conventional approaches to narrative in education. And we'll look at what some of those might be as we go along. Thirdly, just to say that games, again, perhaps obviously, are a multimodal form, and we're used nowadays to thinking of everything as a multimodal form, but games have a particular take on this. So they require our models of literacy to be further extended, as we used to, into the realms of spoken language or visual design, dramatic action, and so on, but also into areas of game design like computer code, which we're not so used to thinking about. So they can build bridges between English media and drama, also with sister art subjects, but also perhaps with a computing curriculum. And I'll touch on this a little bit as we go along as well. You know, what might it mean to code Shakespeare? What might it mean to code a literary text? So in multimodal theories of textual semiotics, for instance, we can see coding as an additional mode, perhaps even as a kind of orchestrating mode which pulls together the other modes in play in a video game, the actional, visual, musical, linguistic, and so on. I want to flag up quite early on what seems to me to be a very big idea about the relationship between games and literature, which is that to think about literature as a video game is not so much a kind of adaptation. It's not so much a way of wrenching literature away from its true aesthetic nature, whatever that might be. But actually what it seems to me to do is to reveal the fact that literature is in many ways already playful. Roger's referred to this already this morning. So the idea of literature as ludic, which is in my title, is very important to me. And I've got two sort of particular ways of thinking about this. One of them comes from the great play theorist Johann Huizinga, whose work Homo Ludens is one of the foundational texts really of the new discipline of game studies. So Huizinga says this, the affinity between poetry and play is not external only, it's also apparent in the structure of creative imagination itself, in the turning of a poetic phrase, the development of a motif, the expression of a mood, there is always a play element at work. Whether in myth or the lyric, drama or epic, the legends of a remote past or a modern novel, the writer's aim, conscious or unconscious, is to create a tension that will enchant the reader and hold him spellbound. So, you know, obviously Huizinga was writing that long before the birth of the video game as a medium, but you might imagine he'd almost been thinking about it. In a different kind of way, here's Shakespeare himself. And the reason why I want to have a brief look at this speech is because my first inkling of thinking about Shakespeare as a video game came from a project quite a long time ago that was conceived between MIT and Henry Jenkins and the Royal Shakespeare Company to make a video game based on The Tempest, which was to have been called Prospero's Island. And it was a project which was never completed, I think due to lack of funding. But the general idea of it kind of grabbed me a long time ago, as I say. And if you think about Prospero at the end of the play, and Shakespeare, I guess, writing his last play, this speech seems to me to be, if you like, Shakespeare on the edge of video game design. I was supervising a student a while ago with Steve Connor, who's now at Cambridge, who was writing about the relationship between literature and video games, and he based his thesis on the notion of ideality, which he took as meaning that each narrative form aspires to the condition of a succeeding narrative form and its attendant technologies. So, for instance, Dickens and Lamb write about street scenes in London in a way which seems to kind of imagine what it might be like to have the photograph. Dickens, of course, knew about photography and was very interested in it, but also perhaps what it might be like to have the moving image as a narrative form. And in the same kind of way, we might imagine that Shakespeare here, a bit like Leonardo trying to imagine what it might be like to have a flying machine, is imagining what it might be like to have a form of narrative in which the spectator can enter the decision-making process of the narrative and decide what happens to the protagonist. So with that in mind, I'll just move on to some of these examples that I want to talk about. This is the splash screen of Mission Maker, by the way, which introduces the use of the software to you. So first of all, a video of students in North Yorkshire talking about the game that they've made. These are two girls. Just a little look at this and some comments to make about it.
So we have E, and we have all these different corridors. Yeah, we have quite a few rooms. Oh yeah. We have another key apparently. Right. Okay, so we have 2 witches, the cauldron, and the swans there. Inspect it, and then yes, goes to the Shakespeare, and then the things that we need to find, the ingredients. So you can pick it up, and then if you look in your inventory, you can inspect it, and then as you go around, you can see the things you need to collect. He's the guy that's protecting the ingredients.
Right.
You need to press F before we come.
I did. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So, and then you go through the waterfall, you pick those up. So that's your ingredients, and then you can inspect this. And it's the first line of the policy.
Okay.
You want to pick that up?
Yeah.
What's he doing there?
He's protecting everything.
Okay, so just a few comments on that. There's a lot to say about the way in which these students kind of build the dramatic world of the play within the game world. So the idea of ludic worlds and spaces, a little bit like the detective space that Roger was describing perhaps earlier this morning. Second, just to say that there's a kind of interesting narrative expansion going on. They're taking these brief scenes of the witches and expanding them into a whole backstory in which they think, where did the ingredients come from? How did they get them? Was that a kind of mission in its own right? Were they magical objects already that were somehow protected by these guardians, the terrifying warrior and the dragon? By the way, the dragon is in there because this software was first developed for Beowulf, and it's still got the Beowulf assets in it. So I have to say that Macbeth design games often become, you know, exercises in how the hell can we manage to get a dragon into Macbeth, which they've successfully done. Also to say that on their screen you may or may not be able to see at the top left-hand side health, prophecy and imagination. So in the software there are programmable game economies which they can designate to represent aspects of the play. And we did an earlier version of this with the globe, where one of the questions the globes asked was how would you represent the motivations of the characters? And this was the solution we came up with to make the economies open to redesignation by the students. So there's a lot to say about economies. I haven't got time here, but it does raise some interesting questions about how you might rethink familiar aspects of narrative. It seems anathema, for instance, to specialists in the humanities to think about narrative in terms of number. And literally in a video game, the whole thing is made up of numbers. It's a distinctive digital medium, as Lev Manovich argues in his book, The Language of New Media. So we're talking here about quantities, which seems kind of odd, though when you think about Macbeth, it's extraordinary how many metaphors of number there are in the play, or quantity. You know, I am steeped in blood so far, fill me from crown to toe, top full of direst cruelty, take my milk for gall, and so on. So quantity is a sort of aspect of the play that's perhaps foregrounded by this feature of the game. I should pay tribute also to my colleague James Durran, who's the English advisor for North Yorkshire, who managed this event and taught this particular session, which was a day's workshop with these students. So we'll go on to another one. These are some clips from a class in London who also had a day's workshop on it. And this was taught by Alison Crosdale, who's a PhD student at UCL, and she's working on this as her project at the moment.
There's like a little battle, because no one's about to win the war. Yeah, they do that. Yeah, so you have this little battle, and then if you real quick make up line, hail to continue it, and then when they come.
Can you talk me through your plan?
So the plan is, play the scroll and give it to so it's supposed to be a scroll on that bar. Once you picked up the scroll and inspected it, it would say Macbeth's letter to her. and if you picked it up with the left click, it was supposed to trigger her like aggression, and she was just sort of fighting you. Yeah. And it would also trigger smoke and her speech, also her long soliloquy.
About the little blue dragon.
It was supposed to symbolize the spirits that Lady Macbeth was pulling. I actually put 3 of them in. I set a lot of rules that said that when Lady Macbeth became aggressive, that the spirits would too, and there was a smoke effect and everything was playing. And
Okay, I don't have time to play all the clips, I'm afraid, but I mean, in the case of this girl, she's taking the letter, she's making the scroll into a kind of programmed dynamic object, which in turn renders the game character of Lady Macbeth aggressive. She's also smuggled the dragons in again, but she's reduced them in size and made them into the murdering ministers that Lady Macbeth calls on. There's 2 other clips which are interesting, which I haven't got time to play. In one of them, there's a girl who's thinking about giving the player the position of the 3rd murderer of Banquo, and deciding that this murderer might have pity for Fleance and try to allow him to escape, which raises a lot of interesting questions about manipulation of the narrative, and also about affective qualities of video games and how they might represent those of literature, in this case pity. There's another one where there's a girl who gives the player the position of Lady Macduff in combat with the murderers who come to kill her and her son. You see the dead body of her son, and she thinks, well, what would happen if it were possible for Lady Macduff to survive? And first decides that she can't do that, she has to die because that's what happens in the play, and then decides that maybe she could let her escape, you know, because the death of the son would be enough to stimulate the revenge needed for the final bits of the narrative of the play. So lots of kind of playing around with narrative, playing around with motivation, point of view, empathy, affective qualities of the game, economies, number, quantities, and so on. So I'll just move to a few kind of general points again to sort of round off with. As I say, the idea that games and literature might be cognate forms in different ways than the ways in which games might, in different ways than the ways in which literature might be cognate with film or drama, that they allow for the exploration or expansion into multi-stranded narratives, kind of obvious point, also mobile and agentive point of view, again a kind of obvious point, that they allow for the building of ludic worlds, as I've mentioned. The rules and economies, I mean, we're not used to thinking of literature in terms of rules and economies. In an early version of this software, we talked to a Year 8 class about this. You know, we said, would you find rules and economies in stories or films? And one kid stuck his hand up and said, well, what about The Lord of the Rings? When Frodo's sword goes near to orcs, it turns blue. And sure enough, that's a rule. It's a rule that's instantiated through the narrative of The Lord of the Rings, and it's a one that would be very easy to program into a video game, as indeed has happened. Economies, we talked about quantified assets. Would you find those in literature? One girl put her hand up and said, what about Hansel and Gretel and the trail of breadcrumbs? And once again, that would be a quantity that would be very readily translatable into a video game economy. Play and pleasure, a point that Prospero makes is, you know, our project was to please. You know, revealing the nature of the Tempest as an entertainment, something again which is easily forgotten in the kind of serious pursuit of literature in classrooms and exam syllabuses. And finally, a point about the learner as designer. We talked a little this morning already about what it means, what kind of educating learners into doing in the English classroom. Are we educating them into being apprentice critics, readers obviously, actors perhaps, filmmakers? The learner as designer. So I think it was Bob who was talking earlier about what the science teachers do when they try to inculcate the idea of being a scientist into students in their classrooms. And art teachers do something similar. What's it like to be a real artist? Music teachers do the same. What's it like to be a real musician? What do we do in the English classroom? So the learner as designer, obviously it's a creative enterprise. And Vygotsky makes the point that people involved in creative enterprises transform themselves as well. They're not just transforming the cultural resources they bring to bear on the project, they become transformed in the action. And in this sense, I think, you're not seeing a child at the other end of an exam machine. You're seeing a child who can ransack a literary text in the interests of a deeply transformative process of design, and a process in which they may, to some extent, transform themselves as well. Okay, I think I've run out of time, so I'll stop there, Andrew, and thank you very much. Stop sharing.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. That was that was fascinating. I love that final phrase you used there, the idea of ransacking a literary text. There's something kind of Viking rape and pillage about that idea, which is rather nice. I know that we've got a few questions. Just an observation from me to begin with. One thing that I was quite interested in there is going back to the whole roots of the literary tradition, Chaucer through Sidney, the idea that literary texts are sites of pleasure but also sites of learning, that kind of duality that's at the root of a literary text, that there's the intentional educative acts, if you like, to impart some kind of learning, whatever that means, but that has to be balanced with the idea of the pleasure of the text, and that idea of play, which seems to be quite appropriate and interesting there. But that's something that's troubled authors, and I'm thinking also of Graham Greene, who nominated certain of his texts of fiction as novels, and he had another group of texts that he referred to as entertainments, where he's making some kind of distinction there and some kind of value judgment about the quality of what's happening. And Brighton Rock, of course, is probably the most famous of the entertainments. So really interesting that distinction that seems to be functioning there. I'm going to hand over in a minute to Ollie Bilas, who's our next speaker. It seems quite appropriate that he's following on from what you say to look at ideas of creativity. So I'm going to ask him to make his own observation in a moment. But firstly, if we could just go back to Bob Eagleston had a question about your reference to ideality. And he was just wondering if you could point us towards some kind of source or what wider reading we might do around that idea.
Well, I mean, I could actually post the... I'll have a look at the student's thesis actually and see what the best, which was a while ago, and see what the best references are and perhaps post them up. But I mean, in my mind, it also went back to some work by a guy at Edinburgh University who I've actually unfortunately forgotten the name of. Perhaps someone can enlighten me about the ways in which Lamb and Dickens, appeared to kind of anticipate the photograph and the moving image in their depictions of kind of processions of people in London, for example. So for me, that was one reference. I'll try and dig it out. So I'll dig them out and post them. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So maybe we could, David, could we give the mic to Ollie, because I know that he had some interesting observations to make.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, you're good, Ollie.
Okay. Yeah, I know it's annoying when people say observation, not a question, but it just struck me that the way that that project with the students encourages them, A, to construct a narrative world, and then B, to explain how they've done it, why they've done it, to sort of justify their choice. And that's what I meant by my comment about it being sort of there being an exegetical aspect to it. And it just struck me that happens quite naturally, whereas in more scare quotes traditional creative writing contexts, students often struggle with the exegesis, to produce a text and then say why you've done it, and it just seemed that followed on really naturally.
I think it does, and there are other ways of extending it. For example, I mean, in one project we got the kids to write walkthroughs of their games. So it's a cultural form that they're very familiar with, But and it does kind of raise some interesting questions about the relationship between games and the imperative mood, for instance, because walkthroughs are all couched in the imperative. But in that, as you say, they have to kind of enter an exegetical mode and transform actually multimodal text into a linguistic and to some extent visual text. So there's a lot of kind of exegesis certainly, but a lot of transformation going on as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ollie. Thank you, Andrew. A question from Graham Laurie, who's interested in the idea of pupils who might perhaps struggle more with reading and engagement in education. Did you notice any particular benefits to the students through this kind of intervention and approach?
I think there is a bit of that, and I've found it before in visual ways of transforming texts. But another interesting thing was, and this relates to the thing we haven't had time to look at much, which is the relation to the computer science curriculum. There are also kids who were particularly interested in programming and computing and coding, who attended coding clubs after school, who were interested in that aspect of this text and how it relates to game design as well, or that aspect of this project. So lots of transference of motivations from one domain to another, I think.
There's been a bit of a thread going through. Thank you, Andrew. That's helpful. There's been a bit of a thread going through in terms of fantasy literature. I notice here, the kind of Dungeons and Dragons. Going back, I remember these from when I was at school. The kind of interactive reader text. You read page 33 and you have then 3 options at the bottom to take you to page 105, 1 and 53, and you make your own way through the text. Interested about that kind of fantasy dimension, because of course you've done Macbeth, a classic text of the supernatural, fantastic. Beowulf is another one that you've done this with, a kind of literary fantasy. Do you think that the benefits you're talking about here translate to other literary forms equally well?
Well, I think there is a point to be made about fantasy, and the way in which this kind of activity perhaps offers a bit of resistance to what I often think of as the sort of ideology of realism and neo-realism, consequent on the birth of the European novel particularly. And we see a renaissance of that now in the kind of reimagining of medievalism in popular fiction and in film and video game as well. But there's also the point to make that some of the texts you've referred to have a direct lineage that begins with Beowulf, that goes through Tolkien's work on Beowulf, that becomes translated into the Lord of the Rings and thence into Dungeons and Dragons and thence into the enormous genre of the role-playing game. So a lot of this reimagining of the medieval can be tracked back directly in that way. So there are some interesting things, I think, for teachers of literature to exploit there. But just to hit your main question, which is what would it be like with a different text? We had a PGC student at UCL once, and I'd always imagined that the perfect texts for game adaptation in Shakespeare with a fantastic text like The Tempest or Midsummer Night's Dream. And he said, well, I'm gonna make a game of Hamlet with my year 7 class, which seemed hugely ambitious, but he pulled it off. And of course, when you think about it, I was thinking Hamlet won't work well. It's about interior angst. It's not so much about fantasy and magic, but of course it's all about decision making and options. Is it my father or is it demon from hell? Shall I kill Claudius while at prayer or shall I not? Shall I kill myself or shall I not? Can I save Ophelia or can't I? And when you think of it like that, of course, the whole thing, although these are essentially the realist mode of dramatic realization, works very well as a game. One other example, and this is, I think, a startling one in a way, which is a popular text at GCSE, which is Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est, and perhaps we might think about war poetry generally, and the fact that the most ancient forms of game, chess, that being the obvious example, are essentially war games. So the serious side of this, and you think of Dulce et Decorum Est, which, like Prospero's speech at the end, is in the second person, it addresses the reader, it offers them an option. If you two, that kind of conditionality that's the characteristic form of the video game, if you two could walk behind the wagon that we flung him in, you would not tell the old lie. So that, you know, that invitation to this imagined reader at home to step into the space of the dramatic world and to make those decisions, in this case, life or death decisions. You realize that video games are not just pleasure and entertainment, but a serious business as well.
Thank you. And that just kind of takes me back, just tying back to one of the talks we had earlier, Roger, when he was talking about the importance of those kind of space definers, the maps and the plans in the Golden Age detective novels, where they play such an important part of defining the space within which the literary text must happen, and what perhaps happens if we take things outside of that space, and how that then affects the notion of you know, the literary and places the reader in very different situations. So thank you, Andrew. Really, really fascinating.